On this Friday night, new revelations in a Toronto terror case.
This is yet another alarm bell going off.
The questions about one suspect's ties to the so-called Islamic State and how he became a Canadian citizen. An imminent threat in BC, a wall of water, an unstable dam, the towns and the fish in danger. Rocky times in the Rockies.
It feels pretty quiet for August.
What's ignited a bummer summer for some Alberta communities. And Canada's mounting Olympic medal count. Who's hauling the hardware home?
Global National, reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There are more questions than answers tonight about a Toronto man accused of plotting a terror attack in the name of the so-called Islamic State and how he was able to immigrate to Canada. Critics are calling it a failure in border security. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson joins us now. Mercedes, what have we learned?
Neithu, the federal government is refusing to explain how a Toronto man was able to immigrate to Canada despite allegedly having taken part in ISIS violence overseas in Iraq before he moved to Canada. Ahmed Fouad Mustafa El-Didi is facing multiple terror charges in relation to a planned machete and axe attack in Toronto. El-Didi was also charged with aggravated assault on behalf of the so-called Islamic State, which the RCMP say took place abroad in 2015. Violence that multiple national security sources say was in part documented in an ISIS propaganda video released in 2015 showing the torture and dismemberment of an ISIS prisoner by a middle-aged man with a sword. Global News has viewed the video that multiple national security sources say is believed to show El-Didi hacking off a prisoner's hands and feet while the man is tied to a crucifix in the desert. Global News is not showing the video due to its graphic content and is not identifying the sources who spoke to us who have direct knowledge of the investigation but are not authorized to speak publicly. Ahmed El-Didi was also arrested along with his son Mustafa in a Richmond Hill hotel. Sources say they had just finished taping a so-called martyrdom video in which they appeared with an axe and a machete as well as an ISIS flag.
So Mercedes, what does this seem to say about the immigration system?
Well, a lot of questions being raised. We still don't know how or when El-Didi came to Canada because the federal government is citing privacy in court proceedings, refusing to release that information. We did learn that the RCMP got one thing wrong. El-Didi's 26-year-old son, Mustafa, is not a Canadian citizen, as they had stated. Kelly Sundenberg is an immigration enforcement officer who is now retired and become a professor. He says this case is deeply concerning and not the first time security screening in immigration has failed.
This is yet another alarm bell going off about the woeful lacking border security we have in our country.
Sundenberg says the system is under-resourced and that there's a lack of political will to fix it.
There's a lot of people who could have lost their lives because of politicking, and that should really alarm Canadians.
The Conservative opposition is calling for the government to disclose what happened in this case.
We need to know how somebody came into the country after being depicted on camera, allegedly doing unspeakable acts. And then we have other questions. How did this person get citizenship?
And how is this person not on national security sources' radar before the beginning of July, Neithu, which is when the RCMP said they first became aware of the concern? So lots of questions for the government here in Ottawa about our security.
Indeed, there are. All right, Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. Thanks, Mercedes. 3 Americans, including Canadian-born Paul Whelan, are back on U.S. soil today after being freed in a historic prisoner swap with Russia. Whelan, a former U.S. Marine, was welcomed late last night by the U.S. President and Vice President, along with family and friends. He was joined by Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gerskovich and U.S.-Russian journalist Alsu Kermasheva.
It didn't feel real until we were flying over England. I'm a British citizen, Irish citizen, Canadian, and American. So as we came over England and I looked down, that's when it became real. We flew over Ireland, then Canada, and into America, and then I knew I was home.
In total, 24 people jailed in 7 different countries were exchanged in Turkey yesterday in the biggest and most complex prisoner swap since the Cold War. Although celebrated, the deal has spurred criticism on both sides of the Atlantic, largely over the freeing of a Russian state assassin in Germany. In BC's central interior, an evacuation alert has now been issued for the Chilcotin River to Churn Creek area over fears a dam could soon burst. Authorities have installed cameras and depth gauges to monitor a massive pool of water that's building up behind a landslide on the river. This is an image from this afternoon. Authorities say the water could break through at any moment, warning people downriver on the Chilcotin and the Fraser to stay clear. As Travis Prasad reports, the province and First Nations leaders are preparing for the worst.
A giant slab of earth more than half a kilometer long and 30 meters deep, swallowing up the Chilcotin River Valley.
Emotional, almost, seeing it. Just the impact that it's having on the mental health and wellness of Indigenous peoples in the region, but also non-Indigenous people as well.
Water destined for the Fraser River brought to a halt, creating an 11-kilometer-long temporary lake upstream.
You can hear it from standing up here. It's usually roaring. You can hear the sound of the river, but right now up here from where we're at, it's quiet.
Stay off of and away from both the Chilcotin and Fraser Rivers this long weekend. We are committed to providing information as it becomes available.
On Thursday, members of the local First Nations gathered for a prayer near the slide.
Anything that affects that river in any way, or the water, the fish, that it basically our identity, and it's in our genes, and that's who we are.
Damage to the fish population is inevitable once the slide lets loose. Experts say their sense of smell, critical for migration, will be thrown off.
This is just a real problem for fish getting to where they need to go. And, only a few years ago, this same group of fish were blocked below the Big Bar landslide.
It's going to require some leadership from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it's going to require a lot of other sectors to lay off of those runs to allow it to replenish itself.
BC officials issuing flood watches and advisories downstream, bracing for the potential of a sudden, forceful collapse.
It will start to erode and cut through that dam, probably releasing a pretty substantial pulse of water.
The question is when. Travis Prasad, Global News, Vancouver.
From coast to coast to coast, weather warnings are in effect as most Canadians kick off the long weekend. In southern Ontario, slow-moving thunderstorms are raising the risk of flooding with up to 60 millimeters of rain expected. Elsewhere, it's extreme heat. From eastern Ontario to Atlantic Canada, it feels close to 40 degrees with the humidity factored in. And out west, where cooler weather had been keeping wildfires at bay, temperatures are well above 30 degrees across southern BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. The warmer weather has led to new growth on the Jasper fire, primarily along the southern flank. It's grown by 25% and is now at 39,000 hectares. The park started allowing limited commercial traffic through yesterday, and Jasper residents can now register for a bus tour to view their damaged properties. The fires in Western Canada are making international headlines, and tour operators worry that may be repelling visitors. With Jasper no longer open to tourists, other Rocky Mountain communities are seeing cancellations as well. As Heather Yourex-West explains, business is slowing down at the worst possible time.
It may be high season in the Canadian Rockies, but the streets of Waterton are not exactly jammed.
It is so quiet here, and this is my first time here, but it feels pretty quiet for August 1st.
There was a lot of bus tours out of the U.S. and other parts of the world that have canceled. They were spending a couple of days out here in Waterton, a couple of days in Banff, a couple of days in Jasper.
An itinerary that's no longer possible. Last month, an out-of-control wildfire forced the evacuation of Jasper National Park.
I had a friend of mine that was supposed to be going the week before me, and they actually already did cancel their trip. We've been just trying to come up with other plans, figure out other options.
We have a lot of guests that have come to see both parks, and so our team is working night and day to help people replan their trips and make the most of the time they've made to come out west. It's been really, really challenging.
Not only do places like Waterton have accommodation open for displaced tourists, there are jobs available too, with dozens offering staff housing for displaced Jasper workers.
August is a good time because we lose a lot of workers in Banff in August, people who go back to school. So the timing could not be perfect in that way.
With the fire in Jasper still posing a threat, it will be some time before that community can welcome visitors once again. But a strong comeback is possible. Just look at Waterton. In 2017, the Kenow wildfire destroyed almost 40% of this national park. There are still scars, but there is also a lot of regrowth and renewal. The resilience of the Rockies that Jasper too will eventually come to know. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Waterton Lakes National Park.
The federal government is reportedly set to introduce a new string of measures to clamp down on temporary immigrants. The details remain unclear, but follow similar announcements made by Ottawa in January and March. Mackenzie Gray is tracking this story for us. Mac, what do we know?
It's quickly becoming one of the thorniest political issues for the Liberals, Neithu, and Immigration Minister Mark Miller says more changes are coming soon. In an interview with Reuters, Miller says the Liberals will bring in additional measures to limit the number of temporary immigrants allowed to come to Canada. The era of uncapped programs to come into this country is quickly coming to an end, Miller said, adding immigration will be a top issue, if not the top issue, in the next election. Global News asked for an interview with Miller, but his office declined, saying he was traveling. Now, what those changes will look like isn't clear, but it will build on a recent Liberal promise to reduce the number of temporary immigrants in Canada to 5% of the population. That means a decrease in international students, temporary foreign workers, and asylum seekers. But the Bank of Canada is skeptical that that will happen. In a recent report, the bank hiked its projections, saying 2.7 million people, or 6.8% of the Canadian population in 2024, will be non-permanent residents. The bank also said there's significant uncertainty that Liberals will meet their 5% goal, and all those newcomers, through no fault of their own, are putting additional strain on a long-standing housing supply problem.
We've had record population growth in Canada against what was already a constrained supply. So we've had a long-standing housing imbalance in Canada.
This chart from the central bank showing immigration levels all the way back to the 70s, underscoring the massive run-up since 2015. And last year alone, over 1.2 million people were added to the population, Neithu, but Canada only built a third of the housing units needed for those people to live in.
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mackenzie. Canadians just keep making history at the Paris Olympics. Today, Ontario swimmer Kylie Moss nabbed the bronze medal for the women's 200-meter backstroke. This makes her the first Canadian swimmer to win a medal in 3 consecutive Olympics. She wasn't the only Canadian taking a medal home today. We'll tell you who else made the podium coming up. Plus, new legal trouble for TikTok. Who's suing the social media giant and why? Fresh anti-government protests in Bangladesh have left at least 2 people dead and more than 100 injured. The unrest started over the country's rules on reserving 30% of government jobs for families of veterans who fought in the War of Independence in 1971. But demonstrations have morphed into calls for the Prime Minister to quit. More than 200 died last month in clashes with police. In Qatar today, thousands gathered for the funeral of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran on Wednesday. Chants and prayers were heard inside and outside the Doha Mosque where funeral proceedings were held. Haniyeh's coffin, along with his bodyguards, was draped in the Palestinian flag during the ceremony, before being taken to its burial site north of the Qatari capital. Top Hamas leaders and foreign officials, including Turkey's vice president, attended the event. U.S. President Joe Biden said today Haniyeh's killing was, quote, not helpful to ceasefire talks. Biden adding he had a direct conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about the need to reach a deal. The U.S. Justice Department is suing TikTok, alleging the company has failed to protect children's privacy. The social media giant and its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, are being accused of gathering information from users under the age of 13 without their parents' permission. The lawsuit also claims TikTok knowingly allowed children to create and use accounts while failing to follow through on parents' requests to delete them. TikTok says it has committed thousands of employees and billions of dollars into making its platform safe. The company could face fines in the hundreds of millions if the lawsuit is successful. Still ahead, how Canada is trying to join the space race. We could soon see rockets being launched into space from right here in Canada. We don't have a commercial spaceport to launch from yet, but that could soon change because the U.S. has agreed to allow Canada to use its technology, expertise, and data for future space launches. As Heidi Petracek reports, it's a big deal because in this space race, so far, Canada is the tortoise.
As we celebrate an important milestone.
The new agreement, called the Technology Safeguards Agreement, is meant to boost Canada's commercial space launch industry, allowing American space tech and expertise on this side of the border.
This means spacecraft, satellites, and the technology that goes in them will be able to be put to use to grow an important sector here in Canada.
A sector that seeks to capitalize on growing space traffic. According to the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, the number of satellites launched every year has been rising exponentially, from 600 in 2019 to almost 2,600 last year. Canadian companies want some of that payload and the profits, but so far there isn't a place to launch from.
There is no easy path to building a launch site.
Maritime Launch Services hopes to be first to take off from the coastal community of Canso, Nova Scotia. But the project is behind schedule, construction far from complete. There's opposition from some Canso residents concerned about potential environmental harms. And the company's plans to launch Ukrainian-made carrier rockets have been sidelined by the war.
We tried every way possible to really keep that growing and that opportunity out there. And I will say that I have not given up.
Vying to beat maritime launch to it is Ontario-based Nord Space, which recently announced it's spending $5 million to make it happen. But its spaceport location hasn't been selected yet, though the CEO is eyeing potential spots on both coasts.
And what we're really looking for is where we have to make minimal additional investments. So there's already road access, the land is fairly flat, isolated, grid power.
When it comes to this commercial space race, orbital launches past Earth's atmosphere using rockets carrying multiple satellites are where the money is. Both companies admit that is still at least several years away from liftoff. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
There was a frightening emergency at the Paris Olympics when one Slovakian swimmer collapsed after leaving the water. 21-year-old Tamara Patoka had just finished a qualifying heat for the 200-meter individual medley. Medical staff carried her out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask. The Slovakian team says Patoka suffered an asthma attack and did not have her inhaler. Olympic officials say she was conscious and is receiving further medical care. Money for medals. Next, why an entrepreneur is giving Canadian Olympic medalists cash. A long drought ended by Canadian tennis stars Felix Auger-Aliassime and Gabriela Dabrowski at the Paris Games today. The duo not only captured the bronze medal for mixed doubles after a tense match for third place against the Netherlands, they've also won Canada's second ever tennis medal at the Olympics. The only other time Canadians went to the podium for tennis was in the 2000 Sydney Games with a gold medal for the men's doubles. And Canada also nabbed a bronze in gymnastics today. Sophie-Anne Maitho from Quebec soared to the podium at the women's trampoline event to earn her very first Olympic medal. And on top of that, it's her birthday tomorrow. She'll turn 26. Today also kicks off the track and field events in Paris. It's arguably the most prestigious sport throughout the history of the Games. Many of its events originate from the ancient Olympics held in Greece thousands of years ago. Despite the glory, many athletes who take part aren't paid very well. As Redmond Shannon reports, at least one Canadian sports fan is hoping to change that.
back on track. Day 7 of the Paris Olympics. And many eyes turn to athletics at the Stade de France, the start of track and field, symbolically the halfway point of the Summer Games. Canada's Damien Warner in the race to remain the world's best all-round sportsman in the decathlon, hoping to follow his gold in Tokyo and bronze in Rio. Sitting in 4th place after the first 5 events on day 1. Fellow Canadian Pierce Lepage and French favourite Kevin Mayer are not here, both out due to injury. A lightning start too from Gatineau's Audrey Leduc in the women's 100-metre sprint, improving on her own Canadian national record with a time of 10.95 seconds in the heats. Athletes in this and other Olympic sports may be getting the limelight now, but can still struggle to fund their passion. Earlier this year, Canadian Olympic Committee Chief David Shoemaker said sport organisations in Canada were on the brink of a crisis. Funds make medals, according to fencer Faraz Arfa.
With funding, we can try to even up the playing field, try to get closer to the conditions, less stress, less work, more training.
Still, many Olympians will be delighted to hear businessman Sanjay Malavia's offer to turn medals into funds, $5,000 to each Canadian medalist.
I think they initially thought it was a prank call, but I was serious.
Malavia says just being able to watch these athletes perform is a privilege.
I didn't know anything about the political side or the financial side. This was just something from my heart that I wanted to do for our athletes because I just believe in sport.
From the pool to the trampoline and the tennis court, Canada's Olympians are making Malavia pay. For him, it's worth every penny. Well, it looks like Malavia will have to pay up again. Canada picking up another bronze medal in the pool. This time, Kylie Mass coming 3rd in the 200 metres backstroke. On the track, Mohamed Ahmed came oh so close, finishing 4th in the 10,000 metres final. Neetu?
Redmond Shannon in Paris. Thanks, Redmond. And that is Global National for this Friday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Air Canada is Ingonish, Nova Scotia. Thanks so much for watching. Tracy Tong will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a great weekend.